there's just so many different ways, and we're actually going to move in right now and talk about, okay, so we were just pretty harsh on the party, but how could we improve it? You want to take this one, Garrett?
Yeah, so, you know, we ran through those complaints, I suppose, and kind of identified the lack of structure that supports proper bottom-up decision-making and you know, this direct, deliberative, participatory, you know, confederal sort of democracy that we've been talking about as what we mean by a decentralized democracy. So the ways that we can counter it are to try to better involve people, to make it participatory, and to hold, to make it accountable, not just to abstract state parties and things, but abstract to actual members. So the first point here is to move to a membership-based party instead of the current structure, which is, as Chris pointed out, a confederation of state parties, these kind of like legal entities, so to speak. And you know, as I mentioned, what happens with that is that the National Party assumes that state parties will take appropriate action to support the key values, to hold folks accountable, to recall people if there's a problem, things like that. But if the state parties are not based in these structures, if they don't have the right structures to hold their members accountable, it causes all kinds of trouble. And so you have this indirect disconnect here where members, individual people, are theoretically involved in their local and state parties, but then not directly in the national party. Everything that happens in the national party is through delegates. And so, you know, you have this very indirect democracy instead of direct. So by switching to a membership party, we can actually engage all of our members. And those members can have direct accountability as individual members of the national party, not just their local and state party. They can actually directly influence decision-making and directly participate in decision-making, see what's going on, and not have these delegate intermediaries that kind of confuse the issue and the waters. Next up is to open that participation, which is, I guess, what I touched on a little bit here, open participation beyond the national committee structure. So again, the National Party currently empowers a national committee which is made up of delegates that are elected from each of the state parties and caucuses. But that structure means that you have to go through your state party and become an elected delegate and you know, be appointed to work on a committee and things like that. It's very bureaucratic in order to get involved in the national party. So instead, we have to think about how we can get our individual members at the local and state levels involved in the national party, not necessarily in all of the administrative work or whatever, but if there's a project, for example, if there's some kind of goal, if we want to say have a national Medicare for All rally day or something like that, there's got to be projects that are sponsored by the National Party. And the National Party does its role of communicating to members and having a space where individual members across the country can come together in that space and participate in planning that event and making it happen and you know, all the stuff that goes along with it. So we want to avoid this excessive bureaucracy that keeps things siloed in committees, and instead make it possible for groups of members to come together and participate in those projects and even declare their own projects. Like right now, there is no way for a group of Green Party members to go to the National Party and say, hey, we would like to have this particular thing happen, right? We want to host a rally in DC. We want to, you know, start some sort of educational program. We want to host a fundraiser online or whatever. There's no real process for that. It's expected that you go through your state party and submit a proposal through your delegate, and it goes through this whole bureaucratic thing. There needs to be a proposal process where members can actually submit the proposal and then get the National Party support to work on that project outside of this very bureaucratic committee structure. We need to adopt better consensus processes. Like we were saying earlier, consensus is a process that needs to be deliberative and it needs to be participatory. We need to make sure that everyone who wants to be involved in that process, in that decision-making process, who has comments or feedback or concerns or anything like that, can be involved in it. So, you know, for example, especially in this era of modern technology, and we saw it during the pandemic, if you hold meetings that are in person or even on calls or whatever that are at specific times, you know, folks have jobs, or, you know, maybe they have to babysit their kids, or what, you know, they don't have a babysitter or whatever it is, right? Life happens. And so if there's things that happen specifically at a certain point in time or whatever, that might actually restrict people's ability to get involved in processes. To get involved in projects, to get involved in committees. That's happened where if you can't make the once a month committee call at precisely 8 p.m. Eastern on Tuesday or whatever, then you effectively don't have a say in what the committee's doing, because that's where all the formal decisions are made. So we want to open that up, and we want to think about how can we have a better consensus process that can work for everyone and be inclusive of everyone, where we're gathering that feedback and integrating it into proposals and trying to refine them and make them the best possible things. In order to do that properly, we have to have better communication. Decentralization requires greater communication and organization to make that happen. So we have to think about our tools and our processes that are going to facilitate this sort of thing. And that might actually mean developing some of our own tools, because we don't really have a whole lot of our own great tools, you know, for collaboration on particularly these politically minded projects. You can have things like Slack, for example, that are communication things, but they're kind of designed for jobs and not necessarily the deliberative sort of process that we want for you know, organizing work. So we'll have to think more about the tools and the processes that we want to use to include everyone, and then what sort of tools would support those processes. And finally, we want to hold states and caucuses accountable. So as we mentioned several times, you know, there's delegates who go to the national committee and are not necessarily, it can be difficult to hold them accountable for their views. It can be difficult to even understand if some delegates are actually speaking for their membership or if they're just speaking for themselves. That's what accountability is, right? It's making sure that they are actually representing the views of their members, and carrying out the will of their members and communicating with their members and all that stuff. So decentralization is not a free-for-all. It doesn't mean that states and caucuses do whatever they want. It doesn't mean that delegates go and do whatever they want. We have to make sure that we're including everyone again in that process, that delegates represent folks. And if there's any sort of conflict between either two delegates or two members at the state level or whatever it is, that we support them through mediation processes, through restorative justice processes, that recall and things like that exist in for delegates, not only for the national committee, but also in all of the work committees where things happen that, you know, you can recall a co-chair or something like that, right? If things are not happening. All of the parts and aspects of direct democracy that we talked about earlier, we need to make sure that that's happening in all of our states and our caucuses and our committees. And right now that's not consistently happening everywhere. Partly because some of our bylaws and rules and procedures and all don't actually require it, or are very vague about it, and even differ between committees and caucuses. So kind of normalizing that and making sure that there's a very good baseline that supports direct democracy is an important step forward. So I ran through the list. Do you have any things to add, Chris? I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean, I've literally seen strong parties fall apart over issues that just needed an outside mediator, right? But there aren't clear paths for that within the Green Party of the United States. So we have a dispute resolution committee, but no party is required to participate, right? So if you go and say we have a problem with this, and the other party says, I don't want to talk about it, then it's over, right? End of story. As far as the Green Party is concerned. The only other tool that the Green Party of the United States has is to fully deaccredit a member party or caucus, right? Which is often not, it's very rarely a rational response to a problem with an individual, for example. So, the lack of that, and I talked about it earlier, right? This mirrors a lack of any kind of real restorative process throughout a society, throughout our, government, throughout our civic world. These things just don't exist in our society. So we definitely need to work them out internally, because we're going to need them as we grow, right? If we're going to, if the Green Party wants to become a mass membership, right, large scale party, like we talked about, we're going to need education programs. We're going to need, kind of conflict resolution processes and institutions. We're going to need restorative justice processes, because the law, like I said, we're living in society that lacks all of this, and it's created a culture that has a lot of reactionary thinking that we're going to need to address as people come into the party, right? And we can't just kick everyone out because they used to have this view, right? We need a way to work with people and move people through things, and where I think that the National Party could kind of play an institutional role in that, right? But the real work of that, again, this is about decentralization, happens on the local level, right? That's where people will actually listen to each other. That's where people have relationships outside of yelling at each other on a listserv or on social media, right? That's where we have common conditions and understandings that we can leverage to move through these things. So while there is a huge void on the national level of this stuff and of these resources to kind of be passed down, right? And Amy L. Sachs in the chat said that their chapter had to get a hold of a mediator from the outside to try to resolve things, and then that's what we need, right? But they shouldn't have to go outside. The National Party should have that. But kind of the double edge of, the other side of that coin is this work is best done at the local level. So even though there isn't that national, we should be trying to put these things in place on that local level. People's opinions are rarely changed by someone shouting at them over the internet. People's opinions tend to be changed by real world experiences that they or people that they love and care about have, right? Years ago, I was organizing with a group, and one of our members was an ex-vet, an ex-military member, and had come from a traditionally far right-wing background. That's my child who's not happy. He's not going down tonight. But he'd come from this right-wing military background in a small town community. Well, one of his, close friends came out as trans, and he saw the entire community turn on this person, right? He experienced the hatred that was coming from his own worldview, and it flipped a switch in him, right? A switch that I could have never gotten by talking to him about political theory, right? He had to experience it. And when I knew him, he was organizing within an anarchist organization. He was active. This was during the Trump regime, and he had, especially specifically during the big spike in attention on immigration issues and ICE raids. And this is a formerly far-right military member who had an open offer that if there was an undocumented person that needed a place, he had a place, and no one would ever find. He was out there publicly saying, "I will shelter you and I will keep them away," right? And that kind of change can only happen on that personal level, right? Something had to happen to him in his life, so that's where we have to do this kind of work locally. But GPUS could do a lot more in terms of just functional structures to work through these things. To outside mediators. Too often we're trying to mediate our own things, and you cannot effectively mediate when you've got skin in the game, right? that creates biases.
One thing that I think all of these points kind of touch on, but it isn't a clear bullet point, maybe it should be added in the future, is how important it is to have a stable budget as one of the resources here, because a lot of what the National Party can and should do is to provide these structures and the infrastructure and the tools, and that could be technical tools like web tools and all to manage organizers and volunteers and all that stuff, but also tools in the sense of training, that we should be able to hire trainers and to pay to fly trainers, that the work happens locally, but we can send a trainer to your local party who can sit with you and meet with you and teach you the skills and to kind of walk you through the process and stuff. That way you're not felt left alone, because unfortunately that's what happens with a lot of local organizers, that you start off with a lot of momentum, and then if you feel like everything's on you and you're not getting any help, that's the road to Burnout City. So part of us being a party, being a network, being a movement, and not just a little local community or local group or whatever, is being there to support each other. And one way that we do that is providing the budget and the resources to provide education and training, which of course can only happen if there is a solid budget. So that's another positive aspect of switching to the membership-based party, that not only is the structure more accountable directly to individual members, but we also have this solid funding base that, the more our membership grows, the more we have this funding. And part of our promise is, if you become a member, we have all these resources for you. You can have the communication structure. You can have the trainer that'll fly out and help you once a year or whatever. You'll have someone help you with ballot access to give you training on that. All of the things that a party needs to get started with organizing.
Yeah, and I can speak from personal experience there. In Illinois, we were founded in the 90s as a dues-paying party. That was removed and moved to a sustainer model. And then in 2017 or 18, I don't remember which one it was, we moved back to a dues model. And what we've found is that our funding is much more stable, right? Under the sustainer model, we were often having more privileged and wealthy members bailing us out, right? I remember the turning point kind of for that movement in my state was we were having a membership meeting, and at the fundraiser afterwards, the state party secretary at the time was talking about was giving a fundraising pitch that was more of a shame pitch, because he said there are 12 people that give sustaining monthly payments to the party. There are 60 people in the room. You know who you are. And then he made his pitch for dues, and it passed. I don't believe it was unanimously, but pretty close, at the next meeting. So that the membership-based party provides a level of stability that allows us to plan for growth instead of going through these boom and bust cycles, which is what happens with the Green Party on the national level, where every 4 years there's a presidential cycle and we get a boom year, right? But then we go back to austerity budgets within a year or two later. I can also say, as a former GPUS committee chair, there's nothing more frustrating than someone coming to me and saying, I want to get involved in your committee and do work, and me having to say, you need to email your state party and get appointed, right? Literally turning people away. And I would usually engage them while they were going through that process, right? Let's get you involved, but you need to do this thing. So we're putting these bureaucratic barriers. And then, I think one of the really central key things is that communication line, right? We really have to improve communication through our, whether it's membership based or our current confederation, right? Changing that doesn't improve our communication automatically. It's a systems thing. It's a cultural thing. And we really need to address that, so that when the National Committee does say we endorse the Earth Day to May Day movement, which seeks to connect the ecological and the economic justice movements in that about week between those two holidays, right? When we endorse that, it means that we are going to see states and parties putting things on a local level, that we are even going to see the National Party putting things on during that week, right? We need a culture where we're centering action at the end of everything we do, action steps and plans and strategies. So There's a lot of ways that GPUS could be improved. Garrett and I and GSOP in general, if you look at our bylaws, it's explicitly in our bylaws that moving to a membership party is key, and it's a realization of decentralization, right? To loop back to what we're talking about, that's what the dues membership system is. So